workflow as associated with a ticket or an issue, whereas this is something different. And so we'll touch base on that. So what we're going to cover is what exactly is workflow, where can VLCS or Virtual Lab Collaboration Services workflow be used, and how can VLCS workflow, I have a redundancy there. So there's a slight difference, and you'll see how can it be used, and then further information, and then the summary. So let's get into it. So workflow, what exactly is it? And so I took the first statement from Wikipedia itself, and so it's orchestrated a repeatable pattern of business activity. That's kind of high-level concept. What exactly? I'm more of a practical person, so I think as we get further, a couple slides forward, it'll become clear to people what we mean by this. So it's basically the flow of some entity from one step to another, and within the VLCS, the workflows know about users, groups, and roles. And so let's take a look. So within our system, there's something called workflow definitions. And the definitions are unique. So there could be something called like a single approver workflow. And I'll show you this on the next slide. But it basically defines certain states of an object and then the transition between those states. Again, we're kind of talking high-level, abstract, but I'll tie this in with practical examples, and I hope it will be clear to people. So the single approver workflow definition, it basically, an object, and that object, and we'll touch on this too in a moment, could be a document, it could be a form submission, it could be lots of different things, but it goes into some initial state. And then there's a review of it. And so a practical example of this is, someone submits a form. And so that form submission, what are you going to do with it? Do you just want it to sit on the system? More than likely, there needs to be some sort of review, or at least acknowledgement that the form has been submitted and someone's done doing something with it. And so single approver basically is saying it's a single approval. So in other words, the person submits it, it goes into some review, and then it's either approved or maybe it's rejected, and then there's the opportunity, if it's rejected, to be submitted again. So that's what this is here. And within VLCS, there is a single approver workflow definition which users can use. Now, more than likely, we're going to have to make some slight modification of it if people need it. But let's get into now the practical examples of, how can you use this? So where can you use the workflow? So as a community owner, you can actually enable workflow at the pages level within your community, for blog entries, for web content, comments, forum messages, and wiki pages, and then there are two additional ones so that I'll get to on the next page. But what does this mean? What it means is that you can apply a custom workflow. So it may be the single approver workflow that we just showed, or it might be something completely different. But these entities, or these each of these category of objects, so whether it's pages or blogs or web contents or forum posts or comments, you can turn on workflow for this object. So by default, there is no workflow when you get a new community. And so that means that if I come in and I add new web content, it's going to automatically, as soon as I publish it, it's made available to anyone within that community. So it's right there and then. Now you could envision where there are other scenarios where maybe you've defined your community is big enough that you have different roles. And so you have someone, maybe you've allowed all the different members of your community to publish web content, but you really don't want that to hit the site until the content has been reviewed by yourself or someone else with a different role. And so workflow would allow you to do that. And the same is true of comments. So maybe you want, by default, people can comment on documents. They can comment on um, blogs, or there are lots of different areas within the communities where comments can be made. Well, it might be that, and I don't really necessarily see this as being used all that often for comments, but you could envision if you had a public site and you were allowing the public as a whole to make comments, maybe it's inappropriate. So maybe you'd want to have some quick review of any comment coming in. So that it's not necessarily something you might want to do, but it's possible. So, and the same is true for forum messages and wiki pages. It's basically, the practical example is adding a review step into the process. But it could be something else completely different too. So it could be, the workflows can be customized, and it could be something where it's not a reviewing process that you're wanting. Maybe you're wanting to kick off some other process. So that's possible as well. So the other two areas where you can use workflows with documents and also the dynamic data lists, and those are the forms. And for documents and the DDLs, it's not a global turn on, turn off, and I'll show this. That's one of the things I will show within the site. It's basically for each form you can have a different workflow. And so that makes sense. So it might be, and we're using this within the site as well. If you provide feedback to us, that's one sort of request. But then if you ask for a new community, or if you ask for a new project, that's yet a different sort of request. And it goes to a different group of people. It has a different email templates within it. So that's, and something I should mention is that all of the workflow can be done without making a single line of code. So it's all, the definitions are defined through XML, and it's fairly straightforward. If you as a community owner need to have, or decide that you want to use workflow for something, it's very likely that you're probably going to need the virtual lab support team's assistance in customizing a workflow definition to meet your needs. But so anyway, that's possible. So as I mentioned, the workflow for documents and the DDLs or the forms can be further refined. And so how do you do it? And I'm going to show you this. You turn on the workflows within the control panel under workflow configuration. For documents and DDLs, forms, again, that's dynamic data list. You configure it through the associated portlets. And so as a community owner, these are some examples, and I've already touched on that. So one might be that you want to empower your community members to be able to provide web content, but you want to actually review it before it actually goes live. So that's a possibility. The other is maybe you want to collect information from your community, and you want a certain group of people to be notified when those requests come in. So that would be an excellent opportunity to use workflow. So that's that. And this is an example of something that we put together for the LCAT, the Local Climate Analysis Tool community. And so they have this request where they wanted basically 2 levels of review. So they'd have the regional review, and then they'd have a national review. And so that's possible through a custom defined workflow definition. So we worked with them on that. If you're gung-ho and you want to learn more information, just type in LifeRay 6.1 and workflow, and this most likely will be the first link that comes up. I can share this with everyone, or what I can do is I'll share it and then put it within the virtual lab focal point community. And so that's it. in terms of the presentation. And like I mentioned before, if you see a need to have, or if you identified a need for workflows within your community, we're here to help you out. So let's take a look really quickly in terms of how you actually would go about doing this. And so let me go ahead and log back in. Okay. So if I'm impersonating someone that's actually just not an administrator like myself, but they're a community owner. And so within this community, if you go into the control panel and you look on the left, you can see at the bottom here, let me make this a little bigger because I think it's probably too small. Okay, so if you scroll down under the communities that you're a member, that you're an owner of, you'll see workflow configuration. And so if you click on that, you can then see that for each of these different resource types, you can then define whether or not workflow is turned on. Now, there are a lot of different entries in here, and most of them wouldn't be applicable for your project. So that's why I said if you're going to want to use it, more than likely you're going to want a custom workflow definition that we can provide. But the single approver that I was referring to is this one here. So if you wanted to do that, you can turn it on for one of these capabilities. And if you've got a community that you want to test things out on, you can do that. So if, for example, if we wanted to turn this on for web content, we could do that by coming in here, clicking on web content, doing single approver. And I actually did do that within our test community, so I'm going to show you over here so that I don't want to spam Carlos, who I was impersonating, so I'm going to close that down. So this is within a community, the Test2 community. It's a private community. And so within this community, I'm going to go into the control panel and show you that within over here under workflow configuration, I have single approver turned on for web content. So what's that then do is if I come back and if I come in and I say, okay, I want to modify this web content that's within here, I can click on this, come in down below and say second version, and then submit for publication. Now, if I didn't have workflow turned on, the language would be different here. It would just be publish, I believe. So, but if I submit this, so you notice that it still says this is a test. So I'm not seeing my update. But if we went to my email, there would be a new email message up here from workflow. So you have a submission waiting for review on the workflow. So I can then come back over to this site, go into the control panel, and click on these areas up in here. So my workflow task, and then I have a new entry. And so I can click on it to see what it is. And so you can see that this is a preview of the web content. I'm going to assign it to myself because it assigned it to a group of people. And click OK. And then once I have it in my pending list, I can actually either approve or reject it. So if I decide that, yeah, this looks fine to me, I'll approve it. Click OK. If you wanted to put a comment, you can. And then if I went back to the community, you notice now second version's there. So if I had rejected it, the submitter would have received an email indicating that the submission was rejected, and you wouldn't see the second version there. So that's an example with web content, how that's enabled. The same thing is possible with documents. Documents, like I mentioned, they're not global. So what I mean by that is if you go into the control panel and you go into the workflow configuration, you'll see at the bottom these workflows can be configured within their respective portlets. And so what that means is that, for example, documents and media, you might want to use a different workflow for one folder versus another, or you might want to do it distinguish between the document types. That's all conceivable. And two, for the dynamic data list, remember those are the forms, you can then define for each dynamic data list which workflow you want to use. So like, let me give you an example. So if we go back, I'm going to switch back to the virtual lab to give you a practical example where we're using it with the forms. And if I come in here and I do the same thing, if I go into the control panel and I look at dynamic data lists here, so these are the different forms that we've defined. And so for each of these, I can go in and edit it. And you'll notice that then there's a workflow associated with this, and I could potentially change that. So, so that allows me for each different form to define what we're going to do with it. And so that's the way that works. And the same sort of thing can apply at the for documents too. So I think I will leave it with that. Unless there are specific questions, I can definitely go into more details or give more examples if people are interested.
Okay, thanks, Ken.
Sure.
Are there questions for Ken? Please raise your hand with the GoToMeeting feature. Any questions? I don't see any questions. Okay, very good. Yeah, the workflow